So let's get started. My name is Mike Masey. I'm a developer at a digital agency called Yo-Yo Design based in Tunbridge Wells. And today I'm going to be talking about responsible animations. Now, before you ask me what I mean by that, animations themselves have become fairly synonymous with the web, I think it's fair to say. It's quite often you come across a website that has either a very simple hover state on a button, a color slowly changing color, to full-on page transitions and fancy stuff going on. And that's all well and good, but if they're not done in a way that is responsible, you could actually cause multiple issues, not just for the people using your site, but for the actual browser. You could cause a multitude of problems. So, as an example, if you were just navigating for a site, scrolling around, and then all of a sudden, a load of things just started happening. That's not a good experience, right? And luckily, that's not something that happens most of the time. But when you do add your animations, I'm going to try and give you a rough framework that can help you do them in a responsible manner. So how do we do this? First up, think functional. A functional animation means that it has a purpose. It's not just throwing in some bells and whistles, a bit of polish, just so it looks good. It's how can we use this animation to improve the actual user experience of a site? So that's functional. Performance. We all like performance, right? No one likes a really slow, chuggy site. We want to hit that nice 60 frames per second, buttery smooth animations. So there's a lot of things with web animations that can kick you in the arse when it comes to performance. And luckily, there's quite a few things that we can do to mitigate that. Next up is accessible. This might be a bit of an odd one for some of you. And it kind of covers two parts. You don't want your animations to hinder any of the accessibility in your site. And this could go from people with vestibular problems who may be going through your site feeling sick, to just not understanding what's going on. There's another side to it, and that you can make your site potentially more accessible by adding animations in a way that helps to reduce the cognitive load. So if you have something that hints at the functionality of what's going to happen when you interact with a button, for example, it helps to just take a bit of load off your brain. This fourth one is a slightly optional one, and it's not time effective in that the animations would happen really quickly and get them out of the way. They should be fairly quick, they shouldn't take up the whole time unless it's the purpose. What I mean by this is they should be time effective as your time as a developer, or as a designer, or as an agency as a whole. But your animation shouldn't be taking up and giving you a load of grief in a project. So how can you create animations that you could reuse? We like reusability, right? And there's a fifth overarching one for all of this, and that is to plan them. Very often, and we've been responsible for doing this before, is you get to the end of a project, you've done really well with your estimates, you've smashed out the time, you've got a couple of days left, and the designers go, shall we add some interesting hover states, or shall we try and add a few animations in? That's all well and good, and you can do that, that's fine. But if you think about your animations as part of a site, and this comes from a developer thing, it's very easy to think this is all design. But from a developer point of view, you can influence how these animations work. A designer may not understand the full way that the web works, or how the user interactions can affect an experience, and how it can affect performance. So if you think about them at the beginning and create them as part of a project, one, you can potentially make better, more useful animations, and two, they're not going to take up a load of your time because you can say, okay, well, we're just going to have a little animation here and it's going to be there for a reason. And you're going to know how to do it. So plan your animations. So how can we do this? I'm going to start fairly simple, with just some fundamentals that I'm sure many of you may already be aware of. As some of you may or may not know, the browser loves animating with CSS, and the majority of your animations that you do in the DOM, they're going to be CSS-based. So even at this level, there are certain things that can catch you out. There are many different properties that you could animate, whether you're using an animation or a key, animation or transitions, but the properties that you animate actually matter. And this is because depending on the property, the browser will handle it in different ways. Browsers have a couple of threads, right? we're all aware, or potentially aware, that a lot of stuff happens on the main thread. All the JavaScript, all the APIs, the styling stuff, the layout, the painting, all this logic happens on that main thread. And we often hear that we don't want to chug this up. We don't want to put too much logic in it, because then you start hitting noticeable performance issues. And this is still very much true with animations. Now, there's another thread that browsers actually use called the composite thread. And this essentially determines the position of elements on a page. If you're using Z indexing or transforms, that sort of says this element will go over this. If you can get your animations to run on this thread, it's much easier to get that nice performance gains, that smooth 60 frames per second. If you want to find out which properties trigger which events, there's this really nice site called csstriggers.com. I highly recommend looking at it. It's quite a simple site, has a list of all the properties, and then just a description of what they will trigger. So when you first load the page, it may do a whole style, paint, layout, and composite. And then if you animate it, it may say, okay, this one will fire a style, a paint, and a composite, or this one will just fire a paint and a composite. Now, luckily, browsers really like animating two particular properties, and that is opacity and transform. Now, the good thing with this is you can do pretty much any type of animation that you want with just these properties. Even if it is just a color change, you could do some crazy stuff where you've got multiple elements on top of each other, fading things in out. I'm not saying you can't use just color or background colors or things like that and animate them, but for the larger, more movement type animations, stick to these. I've seen quite a lot, people using either like position absolute and using left, top, right, or using margins or paddings and animating that. If you switch it to use transforms, it's not going to fire on the main thread. It'll keep it to the composite thread, and you get a much better experience. There's another property that's a fairly recent one called will change. Now, this essentially does what an old hacky way of doing optimized animations on the web with enforcing hardware-accelerated animations using something like Transform Z or Transform 3D. Now, this is essentially a modern way of doing it. It could be tempting to chuck this on everything. I'm going to animate all these properties, let's just put will change and everything. That's kind of a bit of an anti-pattern, because you'll end up telling the browser to optimize and prepare everything to be animated, which means that the browser's constantly trying to do this for so many things, and it works against you. So use this sparingly. Don't just put it everywhere you want. If you can, chuck it in a couple of milliseconds before you actually fire the animation. That way, again, you're optimizing it when you actually need it. So will change is a nice little property. So even with CSS, we can look at functionality in our animations. We've got a fairly simple button here. Hover over it. It'll highlight to indicate that you can click on it. Now, the functionality of this button is it will scroll you down a page. It's a fairly common thing that most of us have probably seen on a website. With just a bit of CSS, we can already make this a bit more functional. Using some keyframe animations, we can move that arrow. It's not much. I'm not saying that these animations have to be big and fancy, but doing something subtle like that, a micro interaction, can do a little bit just to inform a person about what is going to happen when you interact with this button. And this sort of thing can extend to any other use case you may have. It's most likely going to be with hover states, because we're just with CSS. It gets a bit tricky unless you want to do stuff with checkboxes and whatnot. And again, this is using CSS and animations, and transforms, so it's going to be running nice and performant. When you're adding motion, in the case of those scroll down buttons and they move you down the page, be careful how you use that. As I was talking about accessibility and how your animations could potentially cause problems, we have examples of sites with a lot of parallax, for example, or you click on them and they're scrolling you down in a very rapid way or a slow way. If you do suffer from a vestibular disorder, which is essentially a disconnect from what you're seeing to your ears, it can make you feel sick. Now, it's all well and good to say, oh, well, there's not that many people that have that problem, right? Accessibility doesn't mean people with permanent disabilities. If you're ill, if you've got a horrible flu, for example, and you're navigating the web and your eyes are feeling rough, you've got a headache and you're not feeling too good, you've got a temporary disability, potentially, right? If you're going through a site and things start going all over the place and you've got some crazy parallax stuff happening, it's not going to make you feel that good. So It's not saying you can't do these animations, it's just saying think about them. Don't overdo the motion. Do it in a way that's responsible. So that's a fundamental level. Let's add a bit of JavaScript in, because we like JavaScript, right? Maybe? Some of us? So JavaScript lets us get a bit more interesting with our interactive style animations. Now, a common example would be to use a mobile navigation. We've got a little menu in the top right corner that you click on it, and it opens up the navigation. Now, this is a common thing that I have seen across quite a few sites, in that when you click that button, that's coming in from a weird direction. You've clicked in a certain position, and something else is happening elsewhere. Again, these don't have to be big, over-changing things. If you just update that to come from the interaction point, this is actually how the R site works, luckily, it just makes it feel a bit nicer. So context is important, including with your animations. That's just a functional think about how they're working in regards to the actual interaction. Now, how many of you have come across a site when you're scrolling down and things are happening, whether they're appearing or things are moving around? It's a fairly common thing that we see quite a lot. Now, there are a lot of things in creating code to do that that can cause you problems. From a functional point of view, it's quite nice because we're trying to draw the attention, potentially, to certain parts of the site as we're going down. It's quite a nice effect. Again, I'm not saying all animations have to have functionality. They do make the website all nice and shiny and a delightful experience to use. But in this case, drawing your attention. Depending on how you trigger those animations and those events, that can actually create some performance issues as well. And there are some subtle accessibility problems that I see through quite a lot of sites that has a very simple fix. There's also potentially a way to have this as a component that we can reuse across multiple sites. So hopefully I'll show you how to do some of that. So let's start with how you would trigger the actual animation. Now, an old, and you could still do this, is to bind directly to the scroll event. Now, this is fine. You bind to the event, you do something to detect where the element is according to the scroll, and if you have lots of elements doing that detection, the scroll event handler fires very, very quickly, potentially quicker than your browser can actually render. So you may do something else to add, say, a request animation frame around those calculations so that it's only actually firing when it can during a request animation frame. This is essentially, I've got a laser. This is essentially saying, right, we're not doing any animation calculation here. When we see an event, if there's nothing happening, we will do our calculations in a request animation frame, and once it's done, set it false. So it's throttling our animations. And this is all well and good, kind of works, but we've had to do quite a lot of work for this. I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but there's now a very nice API that does this all for us. And it's fairly well supported across multiple browsers, and there's a very nice polyfill that lets us work on legacy browsers as well. There's a few little caveats with Safari, for example, and I'll explain them as we go. So what does it look like? We take our element, got a DOM element, we give it a threshold. The threshold could be a number, where 0 will mean as soon as this element appears, fire an event. It could be 1, which means as soon as the element is completely in view, fire an event. We could have an array of numbers, so we get lots of events firing at each section. So we create some options. There are more options than just threshold as well, but I'm trying to keep it simple. We then create our intersection observer. And inside this bit here, we add our code to do what we want. So this will fire every time that threshold is hit. And then we just observe our element, and that's a very basic way to get started. And this works off the main thread. So it's checking your DOM for the position of these elements according to the scroll position outside your main thread, so we're getting that great performance. So let's have a look at what we're going to do. We've now got a very performant, simple way of adding in a way of detecting when the animations are running. So the code inside will look something like this. We get back a load of entries, which is essentially the thresholds. Now, we've only got one threshold here, so we're just going to check if that particular entry is intersecting. If you had multiple ones, you could potentially, there's a few different properties for entry. You could get the threshold that's been fired and check it against some of your own values. And then inside there, we're going to, in our case, disconnect our observer. We don't need it anymore. Let's free up some more memory, right? We only want to make, in our example, our elements appear. So we don't need to use it. And then we're just going to add some inline styles for our actual element that we want to show. You don't have to do it this way. You could have your own class, that you add a class and that makes something appear. This object assign syntax is a personal preference for mine. You could do animate the element.style, do the individual thing that way. You could give it text style. Up for debate. And we're now finding when our element is in view and we're showing it. And we're using CSS to actually show our animation using opacity, so we've still got performance in the animation itself. So how do we hide it? It's easy, right? You notice I'm using a data animate object attribute for my class. Again, purely personal preference. I like to define my JavaScript-related DOM stuff with a data attribute, because for me it says this is JavaScript only. Now, some of you may have already noticed the accessibility problem with this. This is JavaScript only, right? If you went to the site without JavaScript, for example, you would see absolutely nothing, which is crap. And there's a fairly simple thing we can do. It's a common occurrence. It's quite an old pattern. It's been used by Modernizer, and it's a simple, I keep saying simple, it's the idea where you have a Node.js class in your head, and then you use a bit of JavaScript to swap that out for a JS class. It doesn't have to be much. You update your class, so it only works within that cascade. And now, if you went to the site without JavaScript, you can see everything. It's not broken. Quick side note, if you have a site that is heavily dependent on JavaScript, that's all good. That's great. We have a lot of sites that are heavily dependent on JavaScript. If you go to that site without JavaScript and nothing works, you can't see anything, that's a bad experience. And I know it may not be that many people. But at the minimum, you should at least provide some kind of message to say, this site needs JavaScript to work. It's much better than coming to the site and thinking it's completely broken. Small rant over, it's not a big deal. Right, someone's ringing me, go away. So we've showing our element, and we've used this inline style. Now, there is another reason for me doing it this way as opposed to adding a class, and for me using that data attribute. In our HTML or CSHTML, whatever code, we're essentially attaching anything we want to fade in with this data attribute. Because it's a data attribute, we can pass in some values, which means that we could potentially make our little animation fade-in component editable from the HTML. We've written it once, and we can change it in the HTML wherever we want. So these values we can pass through as JSON. It's just a little custom bit of code. Then we can use that for some configuration values. In this case, I'm going to upgrade my little animation component so it has a bit of movement as well. So I'm getting a direction, I'm getting a threshold. You know, if we want it to appear when the whole thing's in view, we could change that there. We could give it an array. We're giving duration, distance, direction. We want a friendly way of changing this. So rather than using translate X or translate Y, we're saying right, up, down, and we can use that to change the distance. Then using that up, down, left, right value that we put in, we're just going to use it to get back whether it's a translate X or translate Y value. And then we're just going to set it. So we've loading the JavaScript, we have hiding the element by default with our CSS, and with our JavaScript, we're setting the position that we want it to start from. We then, when it's intersecting, we'll set our opacity to 1 to show it. We'll set the translate value to 0, so it moves back to where it should be in the DOM. And then we, again, use some CSS transitions to make it show. Now, there's another great thing about this, is that we've just made this editable from the DOM, which means that we can make it editable from an Umbraco or a content management system. So we could potentially let our content editors control the animations. Don't do that. Because they will mess up your site. But that doesn't mean that you couldn't give them a few set options. You can say, you know, fade in from the bottom, spin from outside, don't do that. But you could give them some options, set some predefined values, and get a bit more interesting with your animations. And it's reusable, right? It's performant, it's got some good functionality, it's accessible, and we can use it across multiple projects fairly easy. We'll just drop that code in. Let's get a bit more interesting and bring in some timelines. Timelines let us do a bit slightly more complex things with our animations. And you can do a lot of this with straight CSS, but the management of it becomes a pain in the ass when it gets complex. So this is where we can use JavaScript to our advantage. Now, you could have something like this, where we've got a mobile navigation, we've got a top level, and we've got a sub level. Now, if you just looked at this, and if you clicked on the sub nav and it just instantly snapped to that, it's a bit of a weird experience, right? You don't have much context as to where you've come from or where you've gone to. But because we've thought about our animations at the beginning, and we thought, oh, how can we use this to create a slightly different experience? We can work it in a way that provides that context. We click on it, it shows it over. It's a nice experience, right? We want to wow our people that use the sites. So why not do that in a way that also makes it easier to use? So how would you accomplish something like this? As I said, the timelines. Now, one potential way of doing it is one after the other. So something happens, then that finishes, another thing happens, and you could maybe use a set timeout, and then you have a load of callback hell, and it's not very nice. Don't do that. Same with set interval. For animations in general, including things like WebGL and Canvas-style animations, stay away from using set interval and set timeout because they don't really run accurately enough. Try and stick to request animation frame for those things because they all run when the frames can render. That's a really great talk by Jake Archibald, who essentially explains how the request animation frame works. I highly recommend watching it. I think it was at a performance conference either early this year or before. Another way you could do it is with the transitioned end or animation end event. You just bind that to an element, and that will trigger whenever a property on an element finishes transitioning. And again, that's all right, but it will only fire at the ends. And also, animation is a bit tricky. The transition end will tell you the property that has finished animating, but there's a lot of work we've got to do here. It also means we can't do stuff like this very easily, unless we're adding a load of different transitions on everything and having to, again, in our CSS, work out all the stuff. So if we wanted staggered animations, we could use something like request animation frame to create a timeline for ourselves. I'm just going to have a little bit of demonstration about how you could do this yourself. Essentially what you would do is create a duration. This would be your timer. Get a last time value, which would be right now, and then current time delta. You create your request animation frame, and this will just keep calling itself. And then in the rest of it, you get the current time, the time that's just passed, you subtract them. You get a thing called delta, which is time passed. We could then use that value to add it onto our duration. We now have essentially a little clock timer. And we could bind that to our various properties to animate the values that way. So this is taking the actual animations out of CSS and updating them using a request animation frame directly in the DOM. For the sake of easeability and showing, I'm going to use a framework called ANIMATE.js. It actually makes doing stuff like this relatively easy. And it looks a little bit like this. If you want to have a look at it yourself, it's animatejs.com. If anyone needs to take that down, yeah. Got the photo? Cool. So what does that look like? You call this little animate method. Give it a target. It could either be a CSS selector and give it a property and a value you want to translate. That's a very simple example. You could also give it a DOM node. You could give it multiple DOM nodes. You could also give it an object, which means that this doesn't just apply to DOM-related animations. We could also use this if we were doing Canvas or WebGL-style animations. We could potentially use this for that. Under the hood, this all essentially does the same thing as I showed before with the request animation frame and creating a timer. So it also gives us a timeline. that we can work with, which you would define like this. You give it a direction, you give it a loop. So in this case, it's going to go 1, 2, 3. And then you can start adding values to your timeline. So in this case, we want a square to move to the right, and then after that's finished, we want a circle to move to the right as well. And again, this is only the very basics. There's quite a few options that we can use. The actual library itself, by the way, is around 14 kilobytes. That's before it's gzip, so it's a fairly nice, small size library. And that lets us do something like this. So how would we apply that for our animation? So I'm only going to take the first little step of this, because otherwise it will be a very long time and probably quite boring for you as well. So in this example, we would get our list, and we want to fade it out. So we're going to go from a 1 value to a 0 value. It's going to be a linear easing, which means it's just straight, and a duration of 300 milliseconds. As a side note, for the majority of animations, 300 milliseconds tends to be a good target for a duration. They can go over, but if you have very simple, like interaction-based hover state style animations, 300 milliseconds is a fairly good time. If you start going over it, it can get a bit awkward with the feel of it. So the next part we want to add is to fade this out. Now, you may have or may not notice, but this fades out, moves to the side, and then changes to, say, back. So we also want it to fire at the same time as this. So we have this offset value, and this essentially says fire at 0 on the timeline. So you could have multiple things all defined in a fairly consistent manner, triggering whenever you want them to. And we're giving the value. You'll also notice this easing value. In the same way with CSS, that you can give it a cubic Bezier and give it custom values, you can do the same thing with this. It also has its own little elastic style easings as well. So as I said, we want to be able to change this to back as we go to the end. The ANIMATE.js library also gives us complete methods that we can use at the end of each of the elements that we're animating. So in this case, we've got this top level heading, we're doing the animation stuff there, and we're adding complete. Now, as soon as that animation has moved over and is hidden, we're changing the value to back, and then we're fading it back in. Well, you can't actually, you could do this with just CSS if you wanted to, but then you've got to add another back button to your DOM element. You've got to think about how you would do this with just CSS. It's possible, but probably not worth your time as a developer, because time is your most important thing, right? So sometimes it can be easier to use a JavaScript library. There is a but, and some of you may already be clocking into what it is. CSS is always better than request animation frame or any other JavaScript, more or less, for animations. So this is ANIMATE.js is a great library, and it works for the majority of things that you need. But if you start noticing things are getting a little bit jittery, a little bit janky, maybe try seeing if you can take that animation and convert it to a CSS one, if you've got the time. Again, we've got to be pragmatic with our development sometimes. It may not be noticeable to the majority of people, but if you're a stickler for detail, like some of our designers are, and myself, you may notice a little extra frame being dropped. So you could actually use ANIMATE.js to trigger your CSS-based animation in a kind of hacky way. So rather than giving it a duration value, you give it a 0 value. So the value will change instantly. Then in the complete section, you would add your CSS transform transition values and do it that way. So you're using the request animation frame, which is a fairly accurate timing mechanism for your timeline, and you're using CSS for the actual animations themselves. It's not perfect, it's not great. Your timings in any animations are very important. You probably spend a lot of time tweaking and making them perfect, and if they start going out even by a millisecond or two, it can be noticeable. So this is one way of doing it, but there's a better way. And it's kind of in the future, maybe now depending on how brave you're feeling. It's a request animation frame, the web animation API. Have any of you come across this yet? Yeah, a couple? So this essentially lets us do CSS-based animations using JavaScript directly. And it runs on two sort of models. There's a timing model and an animation model. When you load the browser, it creates a timing model, and that just starts. It takes a timestamp and will just go as soon as it's loaded. And you can bind to that model to do your calculations to determine how long something should animate for. You then have the animation model that determines what something should look like at any given moment in time. And again, this all runs native on the browser, so it's super performant. And we're getting that CSS-style animations, as if you were writing CSS transition or CSS animation, but with our JavaScript. So this is an example of a CSS keyframe animation. It's kind of doing what our fade-in animation was doing, where it moves it from down up and fades it in, and we're moving it over 0.7 seconds. These are just examples, but there's a lot of options you can put into your CSS animations. This is what it looks like with the Web Animations API. You have a node, a DOM element, a DOM node, and you just call animate on it. The first value you give to it is an array of objects, and inside there is essentially the same kind of concepts you have in your keyframe. So you pass in a transform value, you give an opacity, and the offset in this case is essentially the percentage of time passed. So by default, if these were left out, it would space things evenly. So if you had a third one in there, it would go 0, 0.5, and 1. If you wanted to switch it up a bit, so it had 0.1, you could use the offset value. So that defines what our animation is going to do. You then have all these other options, and these are just some of them. There's quite a large variety of things we can do with the Web Animation API. So we give it duration, we give it some easing, delay. Some of the things are slightly different to CSS. For example, for the iterations, it would be infinite. In JavaScript, it's infinity. You can give it a direction. And there's a lot of things that you can do with this. You can get hold of the start time of an animation. You can play an animation when you want it. You can find out when it's finished. You can actually get access to a timeline. So rather than having to use a library like ANIMATE.js or any of the other libraries, you've got Velocity, there's GreenSock, you pick, you choose, whatever. But we could take that all out and use the native browser functionality to bind to a timeline. And we get sweet performance gains. A really nice thing about this as well is there's another, I should have written it down, really, would have been a smart thing, but there's another method you can use to get all of your existing DOM animations. So if you create a load of CSS animations and you fired them on an interaction state, for example, and you wanted to control that animation easier with JavaScript, you could grab those animations, say, okay, there's this fade-in animation that I want to fire again. You bind to it, hit play, and it will play. And you can also play it from the middle of an animation. You can play it from the start and stop it halfway through as well. You can have a lot more flexibility and control with your animations. If you want to find out more, I highly recommend checking out Dan Wilson's web series he did about it. I created a little bit.ly link because the actual URL is a freaking nightmare. But he goes into essentially all the basics, how to go through it. There's obviously plenty of other resources. The MDN documentation is fairly good for it as well. Now support, I know some of you may be wondering about this, it's not great. This is still very much a work in progress. It's been a work in progress for quite a few years. But there is a polyfill that does let you use it. Again, it depends on how brave and the type of projects that you're working on. If you're working on a slightly more experimental project, maybe go for it. For that, at the beginning, with the little profile pictures moving around, I just went into the browser console, selected all those elements and hit animate, and that's how I did that. So it works in browsers now. There's CSS Tricks also has a very good article about it, which includes a code pen that will tell you what features are currently supported on the browser you're looking at on. So that's Web Animations API. There is a lot of stuff in there. Too much for this talk. Probably a whole other talk next year, maybe.